On October 12th, 1959, Arizonian Brian Scott was celebrating his 16th birthday and living as a normal American teenager. All that would change very soon, though. As Brian was walking home from celebrating his birthday, he noticed a reddish orange ball of light hovering over his dog. The ball was oval shaped, transparent, and becoming more solid in the center. The size of the object was about 6 to 8 inches in diameter and reddish orange. Then, the ball of light came right at his head until it was just a few inches from his face, and then suddenly it shot straight up. As Brian stood, trying to make some sort of sense and reason out of the mystifying incident, he got the impression that some sort of communication had taken place. Strange thoughts and pictures started appearing in his mind, thoughts that weren't his own. As the years went on, Brian lived a seemingly normal life, getting married, working as a draftsman, and having kids. Around 12 years later, on the evening of March 14th, 1971, Scott, along with his friend Nick Corbin, would drive to the open desert near the Superstition Mountains just outside of Phoenix, Arizona. What was particularly strange to Scott, both then and now, was he had no idea why he was driving out to this part of the desert, other than he felt they would find an ideal place for target shooting. Suddenly, on the drive, he would pull over his vehicle, and both men exited and stood at the side of the road. They both scanned the area, with Brian looking up at the sky, and as he did, a strange craft moved overhead and into his field of vision. He would later describe the craft as oval and glowing, and much too big to be a conventional aircraft. Soon, the craft would start heading towards Brian. His mind told him to turn, run, and take over. However, before he could move, the craft was directly overhead him. The craft was so big that when Scott looked up, he could no longer even see the sky. As this was occurring, he felt a pulsating, pulling feeling that lifted him upwards into the craft. What happened next was perhaps even more astonishing. Brian found that his friend Nick was inside the craft as well, appearing to be waiting for him. The two of them were taken into a small room that began to be filled with a fog or mist. Then, they were confronted by 4 or 5 very horrifying creatures. Brian described them as having gray, scaly skin like that of a crocodile or a rhino, with a thicker patch of hide over the front torso. Scott and his friend had their clothes taken off and then led off in different directions. Brian Scott felt like he was either carried or made to float by these beings. He described the ETs as being around 7 feet tall and looking like a combination of earth animals. They had 3 fingers and a thumb on the side. Brian would then undergo an intense physical examination, which first involved him being restrained to the wall by an invisible force. In the middle of this room was a pole which ran from floor to ceiling. On this pole was an odd box that seemed to direct an intense beam of light towards him. One of the strange and horrifying creatures stood near the box, seemingly manipulating it some way. As Brian watched the creatures and the mist, he noticed how the foggy substance would soak into the creature's skin. By this time, the box on the pole was placed on the floor, and consequently, the laser beam was aimed at his feet. He could recall that simultaneously, he could feel a sensation of warm and cold fluids running over his lower limbs. Then the light moved to his eye. As the light reached into his mind, he felt a severe headache spread throughout his head. At the same time, there was a strange numbing on his mind. Then the light went out and the creature manipulating him left the room. Almost instantly, another creature would enter, and this one was much taller than the others. Brian estimated it to be at least 9 feet in height. The giant made its way directly over to where Brian stood pinned against the wall. It reached out and placed its hand on Brian's head. Instantly, a rush of, as Brian would say, thousands of thoughts spilled into his mind. Brian stated that his mind was transported to an alien world where he observed more of the strange beings walking around a planet of jagged peaks in a foggy atmosphere. After this experience, the restraints were lifted and he was able to walk around the ship. Soon, he rejoined with his friend and they returned to the ground. The last memory he had of the strange craft was a terrible odor, described as rotten socks, as if someone hadn't taken their shoes off for 20 years. As Nick and Brian were transported back to the desert, they were gone for about 2 hours. They then drove home, where Brian would forget most of what happened. All he could truly recall at the time was of first witnessing the strange craft in the sky. It would be some time before he managed to unlock those memories. However, almost 2 years to the day, on the 22nd of March 1973, he would find himself traveling back to the spot of his abduction. Upon arriving, he would claim to meet a humanoid entity named the Host. What was communicated to Scott from this mysterious figure at this time is not known. At the time, he began to believe that not only was he under observation by the beings, but that he was being slowly educated by them. The abductions would continue, though, as Brian was subject to abduction encounters on the night of October 25th, 1973, and also he would be abducted again on November 21st, 1975, and again on December 22nd, 1975. It was after his initial reports to investigators and researchers in October 1975 when Scott first underwent hypnotic regression. The session would take place at the Anaheim Memorial Hospital under the care of Dr. McCall. During the sessions, Scott would recall the details of his first 2 abduction encounters. However, during this retelling, he would begin to speak in a bizarre and unnerving, mechanical-like voice. Furthermore, when the strange voice was examined, it was found to produce an exact 1,000 cycles per second on an oscillograph. Such sounds should not be able to be produced by the vocal cords of humans or animals. And this was one fascinating angle of the Brian Scott case. The strange recorded voices on audio cassettes. The voices either spoke through Scott or from other areas around the house. As UFO investigator Timothy Beckley decided to investigate these tapes, he knew that even if a person tried to disguise his voice or attempt to imitate another person's voice, this could be easily discovered. Each voice is very much like a fingerprint. There are individual characteristics in each voice print that are designated for each speaker. As he learned that the voice print analysis of the various entities' voices were allegedly different, that fascinated the investigators. Beckley spoke further with a technician who claimed to have analyzed the various voices connected and associated with Brian's case. He too indicated that they were quite different from one another. The company for whom the technician worked had wired Brian Scott for 24 hours a day for 1 week. They used a 4-channel recorder, recording different frequency spectrums on each channel. They recorded the vibrations of the house on the low frequency channels, and the static electricity was recorded on the high frequency channels. The culmination of the project led them to conclude that Scott was not producing the various voices of his own will. Although the technician did not claim to be the final authority, he commented that some of the frequencies that they recorded were, in his opinion, so low that generally speaking, a human voice could not produce them. During these initial meetings and sessions with Brian, many experts and representatives from various UFO organizations and other paranormal groups who came to interview and investigate Brian Scott's encounter came up with many different theories, claims, and points of view in order to attempt to explain his experiences. However, of these investigators, one would prove to be much more influential than the others, and this would be Beckley. 2 months following the December 1975 abduction incident, Beckley became involved with the case. He would immediately begin by asking Scott about any paranormal or poltergeist type activity in the home. Brian would speak of white streaks of light and balls of light that would make their way through his house of their own accord. Even stranger was the pure flashes, as if someone had placed a flash cube immediately in front of his face. One bizarre event, though, was what happened to Brian's wife, Marla. On one occasion, Marla would end up in such a confused state that she would end up in the hospital. She had returned home early from work after feeling suddenly sick. However, within minutes, she became confused and disoriented. She began uttering bizarre words and sentences that confused her further. Then, she would claim that while in the bathroom washing, she had suddenly felt hands all over her body. She was convinced that an invisible person had broken into the house. She would eventually calm down and describe what she had witnessed in more detail. Her descriptions matched the sudden memories of the alien entities from the March 1971 abduction. What unsettled him was that he had not spoken to her in such detail about the encounter, or she had never seen Brian's drawings. After taking Marla to the hospital to make sure she was not in any immediate medical danger, the couple would return home. However, several hours later, she would collapse again and begin to hyperventilate. By the time paramedics had arrived at the property, she became completely hysterical. It would ultimately take 4 paramedics to restrain her and bundle her in the waiting ambulance for further examination. When Brian returned home to the house and made his way to the room where there was a 1-year-old baby's playpen, he was shocked to find the baby was no longer there. On the edge of panic, he began rushing from room to room, searching for their young child. Then, he noticed their pet dog barking excitedly at the back door of the property. He opened it and, to his shock, could see the young child sat at the corner of their patio. How it had managed to get out of the playpen, locked and specifically designed as there to keep babies in, and then managed to get out of another locked door, remains a mystery. As strange and unnerving as the experience undoubtedly was, one of the strangest aspects of Brian Scott's experiences were the continued encounters with the entity named the Host. Brian says this being that comes through and possesses him. When it calls itself the Host, speaking in what sounds like some sort of computerized language. Strangely, as the voice seems to come out of him, an inner voice that is not his, the entity says that I am one with it. It says, I am, or you are one with me. When Brian asked if it has a name, it comes back and says, I am. According to Brian, the Host was a regular visitor to his house. One of the strangest things in this case was perhaps the strange voices in different languages that Brian would hear and speak. Brian would begin to speak in a foreign language that they later found out was Greek. The family has no idea how Brian managed to speak Greek, a language he has no familiarity with. On top of that, Brian began writing with his left hand, although he is right-handed. Once more, during these experiences, a strange voice began talking to him. Scott and his wife would ask who was speaking to them, and the ambiguous reply came back that it was Ashtar. Even more bizarre, Ashtar would speak directly to Marla, as if trying to prove its authenticity with this voice. Then, events would take another unsettling twist, one that would further forge the unlikely connections between events from the other side and events from elsewhere in the universe. Ashtar would begin to offer Maria riches and all the money in the world that was in exchange for her soul. Beckley would point out that Ashtar was remarkably similar to Ishtar, a goddess of ancient Babylon. What Beckley would also offer was that as opposed to such ghostly visitors being the same as the apparent extraterrestrial abductors, they may very well be separate entities in their own right, but ones attracted to the location due to the extreme vibrations already caused by the Scots' ongoing cosmic encounters. Over the years, there were many people who were a witness to strange and bizarre events involving Brian Scott. These would include such strange cases as automatic writing, intricate drawings of advanced science and technology that he otherwise knew nothing about, as well as detailed information about the history of humanity. Often, these writings would be in an ancient language, much like the aforementioned incident where he began writing in Greek for no reason at all. Interestingly, and perhaps importantly, many of these ancient writings repeatedly point to an important link, a link between our contemporary world and something else. It is said Scott came to possess psychic-like abilities and telepathic abilities. One story involves him being able to bend a spoon with his mind. Like all UFO sightings and abductions, one must enter with both a skeptical and open mind. There are many witnesses who have gone on record as witnessing strange and even miraculous events in Brian Scott's presence. Too often, ufologists and paranormal investigators tend to research cases and only investigate their specific field of work. The bizarre case of Brian Scott shows that there appears to be multiple links between aliens, the paranormal, extra-dimensional beings, possible reincarnation, and other unexplained phenomena. This case raises all sorts of questions with many interesting theories. Many believe the aliens provided some sort of special abilities to Brian, and this attracted beings from other dimensions as well as paranormal entities. Some are skeptical, though, as the story was so sensational, and Brian seemed to lose many of his special abilities after a few weeks of receiving them. The tapes were also analyzed decades ago and have not been analyzed with more modern equipment. As Brian has passed away, it's unfortunate the more ufologists cannot speak with him, and that we are not able to know if these strange events would have kept persisting.